All right, good afternoon. My name is Natasha Abner, and I'm an assistant professor in the University of Michigan Linguistics Department. I'm a white woman with brown hair and bangs, and I'm currently wearing purple round glasses and a black turtleneck sweater, and I am sitting in my home office, but the Zoom background is blurred. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's session of the event series Toward an Anti-Ableist Academy, Advancing Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility at UM. The Toward an Anti-Ableist Academy Conference is 11 events that are being organized as part of the university's Disability Community Month activities. These events grew out of the important work of the Provost Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility Board, which I participated in as a member of the Intentional Recruitment and Inclusive Pedagogy subgroups. The 11 sessions of Toward an Anti-Ableist Academy focus on the progress made and the work still to be done on recommendations to close accessibility gaps across campus for disabled students, faculty, and staff. Each event in the series is between 60 and 90 minutes and has ASL English interpreting and CART captioning. You'll see an interpreter on screen today throughout the event, and the CART captioning is also available through the live transcript Zoom feature. All of the events are also being recorded and will be made available on the Toward an Anti-Ableist Academy website for accessible viewing at any time. The video of our opening event with Dr. Faranmi Okunlami of Michigan Medicine and the Services for Students with Disabilities Office is already available on the website. Dr. O talks about the world we have now and the better, more accessible, more inclusive world we all deserve. We encourage you to watch Dr. O's opening presentation and join us in building that world. Today's session is on requesting accommodations as a University of Michigan student or employee, and it is presented and organized by Christina Klein, Director of ADA at the Equity, Civil Rights, and Title IX Office. I would like to thank Christina for bringing this event into being and for helping to make sure that all members of the UM community are empowered with tools for self-advocacy. I'll be returning in a few moments as a faculty panelist for the event, but for now, I will turn it over to Christina to introduce the panel and tell us more about requesting accommodations at UM.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christina Klein, and I am the Director of ADA and ECRT, formerly known as OIE. I am thrilled to be part of this session today, and I am thrilled to be presenting to you an opportunity to ask questions of two students, a faculty member, and a staff member about their experiences and any feedback or suggestions they might have around requesting accommodations. But first, I would like to give our panelists an opportunity also to introduce themselves, and then I will be coming back to talk more about, to give a very high level overview of what those processes are that are available for requesting accommodations. So I would like to pass it to Pam McGinty.
Hello, my name is Pam McGinty. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a financial analyst and Ideable Program Manager in the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I'm a white woman with dark brown curly hair, and I'm wearing a black lace shirt. My background is blue with a black M logo in the corner, and I'm looking forward to talking with you all today about requesting accommodation to the university. For now, I will pass the book over to Madeline.
Hi there, my name is Madeline Gustafson. I'm a white woman with straight blonde hair wearing square black glasses and a navy sweater. My background is blurred, but behind me is my dorm room. I am a sophomore studying biomedical engineering here at the university, and I'm looking forward to being able to discuss accommodations with you all today. And with that, I will pass it over to Chanel.
Hi, everybody. My name is Chanel Alana Barnes, and I am a junior at the University of Michigan. Behind me is a white wall with some pink flowers. Also, I am wearing a Black Wolverine sweatshirt that has yellow letters with a red collar. I also have my hair pulled back with a black scarf within a ponytail, and I have silver earrings on. And I am very pleased to be in this space with everybody so we can talk about issues that we can rectify through unity. Thank you. And we will pass it on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Chanel. So now I'm going to share with you all some slides that I have to help guide the next portion of the discussion. See if this works. Yes, okay. So they've already introduced themselves, but I really wanted to emphasize our panelists today, Chanel, Madeline, Pam, and Natasha. Really a big portion of today is going to be an opportunity to ask them some questions. My role here is to first just give a quick overview of the different processes available to request accommodations, depending on whether you're a faculty member, a staff member, or a student. I also want to be very clear too about my role that I'm very excited about too, which is like attendees in the audience today, is I want to learn. My role is that of ensuring that we are meeting our responsibilities under the Americans with Disabilities Act, but it should never stop there. It should always be an opportunity to go beyond compliance, as we've said in past sessions. And I think listening to the folks who are seeking accommodations, who have these experiences and this expertise and this knowledge is important. So I'm very excited to be part of this conversation so that I can also learn from it and see what we can do to inform our practices moving forward. So along those lines, I mentioned going beyond compliance. As the ADA coordinator or director of ADA, it should come as no surprise that part of my role does have to do with complying with the Americans with Disabilities Amendment Act. That law is a civil rights law, and it essentially has three overarching elements to it. The first is that it prohibits disability-based discrimination. It prohibits disability-based harassment. And it also requires the provision of reasonable accommodations to qualified individuals with disabilities to ensure that they have equitable access to the programs, services, and benefits provided here at the university. But as with a previous session when we talk about beyond compliance, it's always important to remember that the ADA is a floor. And what I mean by that is it's just the beginning. It's just the starting point. Certainly, we have to ensure that everyone is meeting these responsibilities under this law, but that the conversation should always be continuing. What can we do to increase accessibility and inclusion wherever possible? So the overview, I have three slides here on the overview of accommodation processes at the university. The first is for employees, and that includes faculty and staff. And it includes every type of faculty member, lecturers, tenured or non-tenured, adjunct, also every type of staff member, seasonal, temporary, student employees, third-party staff, folks who work with us at the university but are sort of on loan or are facilitated through a third-party agency. To request accommodations, typically as an employee, is we have a decentralized process where employees may request accommodations by notifying a supervisor or manager, their human resources representative, or they can contact me directly to ask about accommodations. From there, the employee and the appropriate unit representative, facilitated by myself or by HR, depending on the circumstances, will engage in this interactive process where it's essentially a collaborative effort between employee and the unit to determine what reasonable accommodations will be provided. Now, it's important to always remember that these processes are very much case by case, very fact specific, and will really depend on the specific circumstances, the individual's position, the needs of the unit, the needs of the employee, and what's just all the different options out there. Ooh, There we go. So the students process is a little bit different in that it is centralized. It is a centralized process that's managed by the Services for Students with Disabilities Office. Essentially, a student will register with SSD. SSD staff coordinators will then engage in this interactive process by engaging with the student directly, and also as needed, will engage with faculty or others to determine reasonable accommodations as needed. I will note as well that SSD does have other resources and supports as well beyond just accommodations, but this slide focuses primarily on that accommodations process. I will note that in the past, the system for requesting accommodations included students using visa letters, documents where they would share those directly with their faculty member to request accommodations. But in the recent fall, there's been a new Accommodate system implemented that would allow for electronic conveyance of approved accommodations to faculty members. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that, as we get used to that system, how that can be a tool that we use moving forward. And then finally, I did want to make very clear, this kind of goes along with the session on Monday called Beyond Compliance around the graduate student assessment survey. And essentially for graduate student employees, so they do have a separate process that's available pursuant to the GEO, the Graduate Student Union contract. These accommodations can be granted formally or informally, and each unit has an administrative designee to help graduate student employees navigate the process or get connected to appropriate resources, as well as a centralized entity in Rackham, Darlene Ray Johnson in particular, who assists with that process as well. The next two slides, I wanted to make sure I provided in the slide deck, and they'll be available after the presentation as well. They specifically list out University of Michigan resources, including the Services for Students with Disabilities Office, my office and me, and the Graduate Student Program and Graduate Student and Program Services Office as well. And in addition, I did want to note that there are also resources external to the university that are very helpful. In addition to those specifically to Michigan, such as Michigan Rehabilitation Services, services specific to Ann Arbor, like the Ann Arbor Center for Independent Living. But also there are some national resources as well, or federal resources, including the Job Accommodation Network, which provides some good guidance and suggestions for accommodations, as well as the Department of Justice and Office for Civil Rights and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing the slides and get to probably the more exciting piece of our conversation today, and invite the panelists to come back so that we can get started with asking them some questions and get the discussion going. All right, so the first question I have is for all the panelists. I guess starting with, I'll go in sort of introduction order if that's okay. Starting with Natasha, could you tell us a little bit more about your experience, either at U of M or elsewhere, with requesting accommodations? And my apologies, before you answer, I will drop this question. I'll drop each of the questions into the chat. And as we're having our discussion today, I will pause and monitor the Q&A function. So if you have questions for our panelists, I'll stop and ask those as they come up. But the first question to Natasha, sorry, my apologies, and in the chat, if you could tell us a little bit more about your experience either at U of M or elsewhere with requesting accommodations.
Yes, so my primary experience with accommodations at U of M is providing accommodations for students in my classes. Unfortunately, the bulk of my experience with requesting accommodations was growing up and not having my access needs met as a student and being pretty miserable and having pretty poor educational outcomes as a consequence of that. That shifted as I got older and is not something that I have faced at the University of Michigan. But again, my primary experience at U of M is just in providing accommodations as a faculty member.
So playing off that a little bit, Chanel, could you tell us a little bit about your experience?
Yes, thank you so much. So I come from the Detroit public school system, and from there, I had accommodations. I had an IEP with reading comprehension. Overall, it's difficult for me to understand and comprehend all that I read, and also I had accommodations within math as well. So my learning disability had an effect in my transition to U of M. And so I was already feeling very fearful as a U of M student. Outside of my racial identity, my abled identity, where I already felt like an outsider with just feeling ostracized with this learning disability. Am I going to be able to handle these classes? And so I came to U of M with a IEP, and I honestly, to be honest with you guys, as a student and me being a third year now, I can reflect on the whole process with me being a part of SSD at the time. It was pretty hard. I at the time I had to go through CAPS. I'm not sure if that's still the case, but I had to go through CAPS to get approval that I was verified to be a part of SSD. And they saw, and when they looked over my IEP, it was complications with is my learning disability valid is it valid to receive accommodations from the University of Michigan? And so it was like this whole process with CAPS and the transition from CAPS to SSD. I didn't get my accommodations until the second semester of my freshman year. So my first year, I didn't have accommodations. I was working towards that whole semester to get it. So that's my personal experience. As a junior now, I'm finding it to be more easier for me to communicate with my advisor through SSD in terms of what I need and et cetera. But that's my experience, and hopefully it can inform anybody.
Thank you. And Madeline?
Yeah, I certainly have a pretty unique experience with accommodations, just because I also had an IEP for a physical disability. I have cerebral palsy, and it was dropped when I went to high school. So I went my entire high school life just not receiving accommodations. I still had to walk. So pretty much the conversation was, if I'm tardy to class, excuse it. And then when I got to Michigan, I met with a friend, and I noticed one of my biggest concerns. Obviously, I went to the University of Michigan when everything was online. So I'm quickly learning that things are definitely a little different this year. But one of my biggest concerns was, can I get to class on time? Will I be able to get to class on time? Can I handle that distance? And so I met with a friend who also has cerebral palsy, and she told me, register with SSD. And so I booked an appointment, spoke with a coordinator, and we started discussing what would be the best course of action for me, what transportation services are available here at the university, can I park my car, how can I do that, where on campus is most accessible for me, and then also priority registration for classes to make sure I can get the times I need to accommodate the distance and time it takes me to walk between classes. And yeah.
Thank you. And then Pam, to you specifically as a staff member, could you tell us more about your experience as well?
So first I would like to touch on the whole college student experience, because I actually went to college before the ADA. And that was back in the days when they didn't have very good accommodations. I actually dropped out because my classes were becoming too difficult for me without accommodation, and went back years later to finish my last couple of classes, and I had coach services, and that was the difference between night and day. And I was able to serve through my last couple of classes with flying colors, and it was so much easier for me. So it really made a big difference. So as an employee, I've been at the university for over 21 years. So I've worked with a lot of different departments over the course of my career here for my accommodation. Recently, I've been working with Cindy Zielinski, and I'm happy. And so what I normally do is to start the process, you go to the I'm Happy website, fill out a form, and then they get back with you and set up an appointment. They do ask that you have medical documentation of your disability to work with them, just to mention that. And then you sit down with them, talk about what your needs are, and see what, might work best for a particular need at that time. So like, depending on the situation, sometimes there may be different kinds of resources to try out and see what works best. So like recently when we went home for the pandemic to be virtual, there was no online caption services. Nobody was prepared for us to go home and work like that. So Cindy reached out to Maria just to see if there was like a way to maybe tap into the computer or something, like listen better. But unfortunately, that wasn't an option. So we looked into different things, what options were available, figured out that Microsoft Teams at the time had auto caption, and so did Google Meet, which of course they didn't have transcription at the end of the meeting, which they do now. But that's what we did as a workaround until Zoom became available. So that was really helpful. And now when Cindy does her recommendation to put tomorrow in the next format, send them to the supervisor, and then helps me put them in place. And anytime anything changes, I can read it out to them.
Thank you all for sharing that with us and sharing more about your experiences. I'm seeing that we are getting a couple of questions. Thank you, and please keep them coming. I would like to ask the next question first, and then we'll sort of transition into some of these specifics around the differences between like an IEP and a 504 plan, and then some strategies to be more inclusive or to provide accommodations when there isn't SSD documentation. So I'll get to those in just a moment, but I want to also first ask these next two questions. And it's sort of a two-parter for folks. The first is, based on your experience, what were some positive highlights with that experience? And then of course, in looking at the positive, are there other opportunities for us to improve? And again, I'm particularly interested in this given that I help facilitate some of these processes. I guess I can open it up to the panelists, or I can call on y'all. How about we go in reverse? Pam, would you like to start?
Okay, so for me, my positive experiences are just the interactive process. And when you go to request an accommodation, a lot of times people don't know what they really need, they don't know what options are available. And it's really nice to be able to work with somebody that understands, what accommodations people have requested before or what's out there. And then they give you the opportunity to try it out. And sometimes even have like devices that you could test out and see if it works for you or not. And that's really nice to know that you have that support. And somebody can call and say, hey, this is happening. People are wearing masks. How do I talk to people that have masks on? What options are available from the university, from my department to have masks that are accessible, and that sort of thing. Well, that's been very.
Any opportunities for improvement that you might note, or that you would want to share? And if not, that's okay too.
Oh, I'm sorry, Pam. I didn't know it was open to the audience.
Sorry, you want me to go ahead? Okay. So as you said, the process is very decentralized, and that's the one thing that I think would really be improved, because with the fact that I've been here for so long, people kind of know that I've been here, and maybe I might know what's the best way to go. So people reach out to me and say, how do I get accommodations for this professional development I want to take? And I send people to Christina, or I send them to Cindy, because they just don't know how to find those resources. But the good news is we now have this great website called disability.umass that has all these resources out there, and hopefully will make it easier for people to find. And that's also where the idea board report is. I'm sure you've heard about it probably in other sessions. But I also think that there's a lack of education with the supervisors as well, because I don't know where to go or how to help the employees. And then, a lot of people don't understand that having a person with a disability working on your team is not really a hardship. The ATA is not meant to, make it harder for you. It's meant to be there to help your employees be successful in their job. And the more support that you can give them, the more understanding, compassionate you can be, the better it will be. So the more education and information we can get out across the university campus, the better.
Thank you. And Chanel?
Yeah, thank you, Pam. To ditto off that point, awareness through the teachers. I think there's just a stigma of going to SSD, like there's just this huge stigma around SSD in general. If you're part of SSD, then you're not a smart individual. U of M has this thing called leaders in best, and it's like for you to be a leaders in best, it is for you to like be on your P's and Q's and not receive help, not receive a support. And I countless times see my friends have anxiety attacks before an exam and feel as if they're not a leaders in best student, like they aren't capable. But the reality is, I think if we work towards more of a strategic marketing strategy, that SSD is not just something that is in the corner, but is for all people to know and for all people to see, hey, let me be curious about my learning disability. Do I have a learning disability? Do I need to check into SSD? I think more awareness around SSD and bringing it more to light to students and not having it to be something that is stigmatized, but something that is for all people, and that it is a space where it is open and, hey, like educating students, even if they're not around the disability community, because also a lot of times people in the disability community can feel targeted because people outside of it aren't educated, are ignorant to these resources and to these accommodations. And so I guess specifically what I'm saying is more awareness. I like, Pam, how you said teachers, like bringing teachers more involved in SSD and not something that is just said on the syllabus and keep it going, but making it more aware to the students, and also more like a strategic marketing strategy to make SSD accessible to all students, and for students to become curious of SSD and if they need accommodations or not, and break down that stigma, because then we will have students more curious of, do I need accommodations, and etc. I'm even thinking about billboards around campus, or just like more one-on-one interaction with like tabling on the diag, like making SSD something that is a part of U of M's community, which it is, but something that is not, because that oftentimes is pushed to the corner, I feel as if as a student. So that's where I come from.
Thank you. And I will plug this at the end as well, but tomorrow's session, our closing session, is around embracing disability culture at U of M. I think that's part of this as well. And I think that's part of this ongoing conversation, which would hopefully lead to some additional improvements. And Madeline?
Yeah, I want to piggyback off of what Chanel said about like just even the initial first step of going to SSD, especially for me, because I came from high school where accommodations were just a conversation. It wasn't necessarily something I had officially. It wasn't something that even I felt like needed to be recognized. And then my friend was like, but you realize you can get this, right? Like there are resources for you. And I was a little shocked, and I did put off my initial like meeting with my coordinator for a little bit, because I'm like, do I really need to do this? Like, I don't know, like I'm not walking at all this semester. Is it really something I should do? And I think just the feeling of like, is this valid? Is it okay for me to get accommodations like that? But then in receiving those accommodations, just the communication I felt, because the process for students is more centralized, just being able to sit down with someone and talk through, this is how I experience life, this is what's difficult for me, what can you offer to make things easier? One thing I've got a slight critique on is the response time maybe isn't as quick as I hoped, especially with this semester. I was looking into getting a parking pass and figuring out where to park on campus. And thankfully, I was having issues with my car. So I still didn't have a car on campus until 3 weeks into the semester, but I also hadn't heard from SSD until about 2 weeks into the semester. So that was a little frustrating, but it also kind of worked out. So, so we're all right, but definitely I like the communication and just not only knowing that it's available, but there's no shame in making that first step.
Thank you. And Natasha?
Yeah, to respond to the first question about positive highlights, I would say what I noticed from my own personal experience was that when my access needs were met, I stopped hating school. And as a professor, I've noticed that when I create an environment where we are open to meeting everyone's access needs, it just creates a much better climate for students to learn. So it's just better for the goals that we have ideally as teachers. In terms of opportunities for improvement, I'll just echo a lot of things that folks have said already. We need to make the whole process easier and faster for everyone. I think we also need to make it, and here is where I think the Services for Students with Disabilities Office is already moving in the right direction. I think we need to make it a process where people can have their access needs met while still maintaining control over what personal information they divulge. And I know the Services for Students with Disabilities Office is already moving away from requirements regarding like having a lot of diagnostic and personal information, which I think is great. I think that also needs to be extended sort of outside of the realm of official accommodations. I think professors should absolutely not expect to, be entitled to any student's personal information and should nevertheless provide whatever access needs they have. I'm also on team provide for people's access needs even without the accommodate or visa form. And I think it would just be great if we all just good faith listened to whatever people say they need for themselves and then do our best to do that. And then finally, the biggest area of improvement, I would say, is that we need to just end the shame and stigma around needing accommodations. And I think that will also resolve a lot of the issues that I've heard from students about getting accommodations across the board. A lot of the concerns that I've heard from students about being hesitant to use accommodations or to go to these Services for Students with Disabilities office. And I think, yeah, if we just work together to end the shame and stigma around having different access needs as part of natural human variation, we would all be in a better spot where we would have more people's access needs met.
Thank you all. I really appreciate, again, like I said, this is the value in this is significant because, again, the only way to keep on improving is to hear more. I will say what I appreciate in this discussion is very similar to what happened when we did the Student Idea Board. What was so excellent about that as a group is that I personally was able to hear feedback from folks who have engaged in this process. I know SSD did as well. And to Natasha's point, that they've heard those, they've started to incorporate a lot of changes intended to address those concerns. So again, just showing that, taking this opportunity to hear and to then respond is invaluable and part of growing as an institution. I want to pause on the prepared questions because we've received a bunch of great ones already in the chat and the Q&A. I do want to say there's a couple in there that are actually going to lead into the next prepared question, so I'll get to those. But first, I want to open this up to the group in case folks have responses, or I could speak to this as well if needed. But are there differences for students who ask for accommodations who did not have an IEP in secondary school, but have received 504 accommodations? Does anyone want to speak to that? Natasha?
So someone who actually works in the office can also chime in to the extent that I'm wrong here. But my understanding is that regardless of whatever background you're coming in with, if you had an IEP, which is an individualized education plan, which is part of the accommodations that students with disabilities in K-12 education receive. So whether or not you had an IEP, whether or not you've qualified for Section 504 accommodations in the past, whatever your background is, when you get to U of M, you can meet with the services. Sorry, I think someone also posted the office name change, but when you get to U of M, you can meet with the people who help provide accommodations on our campus and figure out what your accommodations will be when you're here. And that's sort of completely independent of whatever your background is. You get sort of like freshly evaluated, or it's kind of gross language, but you get sort of a fresh assessment of what accommodations you need in order to succeed at U of M.
Thank you. Anyone want to add to that before I go to the next attendee question? Okay, so like I said, I have 2 questions out there that are about the next prepared question. So I'll get to those in just a moment. But one question we've have is, what is the timeline for requesting accommodations and receiving them? And I'll get to the part 2 in a second. But sort of for the first one, again, I can speak to a portion of that if folks.
I guess I can speak on that a little bit. For me, it was sending an email to SSD like, hey, I want to speak to a coordinator. And first and foremost, getting registered. I don't know if it's changed since last year because I know changes are being implemented. And so then I got an email back with a Zoom link. I attended the Zoom meeting, and then literally within 5 minutes after the Zoom meeting, I was given I had maybe 5 emails in my inbox post a meeting about like textbook accommodations, paratransit, all those sorts of things. And just knowing that those were available to me. I should probably preface that I do not have a visa letter. So I'm still receiving accommodations without a visa letter, simply because of like the accommodations I receive. So I may have a different experience than other people if anyone wants to help me out.
If I can just chime in again here, this is again similar to what Madeline was saying. I would strongly, as a faculty member, encourage students to just ask their professors for accommodations, whatever status their like official paperwork is. So there is that timeline for getting things into the system officially, but please just ask for the accommodations that you need, even if you don't have the paperwork to back them up.
And I will speak to the employee side around timeline, and that is to provide one of the most frustrating answers, but it's a common answer from me, from folks who have worked with me, which is, it depends. Because of the decentralized nature of employment accommodations, that process, it's going to depend on a lot of factors, including what's being requested, whether or not we're talking about an employee who might be on leave or is taking leave, whether the employee is, whether we're talking about temporary or interim accommodations while we're working out a long-term plan, who we need to consult with. The thing too about employee accommodations when they come to me, for example, is that kind of like with student accommodation, as with any accommodations actually, whether it's student or employee, is that someone can decline accommodations or decline to engage in the process. So sometimes there may be some additional time where someone will meet with me, and then I share what their resources are, what their options are, and they want to take some time to evaluate how to move forward. And I can try and answer questions to assist with that. But it can be, there's been times when an employee met with me and I called their supervisor to arrange the accommodation, and come to find out the accommodation was already in place. And then there were other times where there were other complicating factors that extended the timeline a little bit. But the overarching goal is always, as quickly as possible, always ensuring that we're engaging in good faith, and that, avoiding any undue delay wherever possible. Anyone else want to speak to the first part of that question? There is a part 2. Okay, so part 2, what kinds of accommodations have been made for people in the past, specifically for neurodiverse people? So, any panelists? Okay, so I will just say that in terms of on the employee side, my experience with the employee side, that's where I have most of my experience. My experience on the student side is a bit more limited because SSD is our centralized resource for that. Again, the answer is it depends. It really depends on the individual employee and what they're experiencing. The question I always ask someone when we're trying to evaluate what types of accommodations would be effective for them is to ask the question, what is it about the workplace or the work itself or the way the work is done? What is it about these things that's creating a barrier that we can remove? And then we really dig into that. Tell me more. Is it distractions? Is it the way that instructions are communicated? When they're communicated, someone pops their head in your office, says something and then pops back out, or are there other pieces that someone's noticed where, there's an impact, there's a barrier there. And then we really try and dig into what can we change in that environment? What can we change about the work to remove that barrier and to create more access? I will also plug one of the resources I listed, which is the Job Accommodation Network. They have a resource guide there that really goes by disabilities. You can sort of search the disability and it will list some potentially effective or helpful accommodations as well. And it's a good starting point for folks. It even, like I said, touches base on communication methods that might be more effective or helpful. Something I struggle with, but slowing down in your speech or asking follow-up or clarifying questions, sending summaries, things like that can be very helpful as well.
Can I add on to that point?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciated how neurodiversity was brought up in the question. And so I can only speak from my personal experience as someone that has a learning disability. I can say that for me, I have extended time on exams, but then it depends on the professor too. And I didn't want to bring that up. I just felt in my spirit to say that a lot of the University of Michigan professors, not all, but I noticed that the professor picks and chooses what they want to give as accommodations, even though I have a visa form, and a visa form is basically a list of things that I am receiving from SSD. My list of accommodations. And with my experience, I've noticed that some professors are more open to helping me and going over it beyond if you need to record your essay, then typing it out, you can do so as well. But then there's other professors that are really not really understanding of my accommodations, and they're just oblivious. And I think that that is an issue that definitely needs to be resolved within the faculty at U of M, of just even teachers being receptive of what accommodations are, being in tune with the students. Because even right now I have professors, and I had a professor, I dropped one of the classes. I had a professor that just really wasn't in tune to my needs, even with the visa form. And so personally for me with the learning disability, I do receive extended time on exams. I get a quiet space to take my exam in, but then there are times where there's a mini pop quiz and I'm just there. So it's that's my experience. And so I think SSD accommodates to different people's disabilities, like Madeline and her physical disability. I don't receive hers, but I think it also is an issue within the U of M community overall that goes outside of SSD.
It speaks to the broader nature of accommodations. It's not just me or SSD who's engaging in this interactive process with you, but also it's the implementation, it's the provision, it's the continued accessibility and inclusion is what I'm hearing. I'm sorry, Natasha, I jumped in before you could.
I was going to say, well, first of all, Chanel, I am so sorry that you've had to deal with that. It's wildly unacceptable, but I definitely have a lot of hope that we are moving in the right direction, especially with, events like this. And I'd like to actually use your answer as a way to respond to another question in the Q&A, which was how can we balance providing accommodations without official SSD notification? And I would like to say, and still encourage, and still encourage students to seek out official documentation so that we have sufficient funding tracking, et cetera. And I think stories like Chanel's are, I frequently use stories like that as a way to get students to seek out official accommodations on top of like whatever I unofficially provide in classes, because yes, as Chanel observed, students are sometimes unfortunately like subject to professors' discretion about what sort of accommodations they receive. However, if you do go through the process of getting the official SSD form, it is no longer the professor's choice whether or not they accommodate you. They are legally obligated to do what that form says. So you have that legal obligation in your corner to get your needs met when you get that official documentation in place.
Thank you all again. I have one more question from the Q&A, and then we'll go back to the prepared questions. And I want to expand this a little bit. What are some challenges that you believe students or faculty or staff face in the online space, like online and hybrid class or work, as it relates to accommodations, services, and resources? How can we better support folks in the online environment? So I expanded that from just students to include staff and faculty as well, because I know, Pam, you specifically talked about this.
Oh, is Pam gonna go? Okay, so I would say big things. Make sure that the online content is actually accessible. So that's where we have in place things like cart captions, interpreters, visual descriptions, so people with various sensory needs can have access to that online space. That's a big one. And then this also, I think, connects back to the questions about neurodiversity, because a lot of our neurodiverse community members are going to experience like differential difficulty with navigating the online space. Like if you have ADHD, it might be even harder for you to pay attention on a Zoom meeting. Or if you have a mental health disability, you might be especially prone to having episodes or acute difficulties because of the like online experience, or obviously because of the collective trauma we've all been going through for the past year and a half. So I would say, yeah, be mindful of the sensory needs that different people have, and then also the neurodiversity needs that different people have in navigating the online space.
I agree with that, Natasha. That's a great point. And turning on the captions in Zoom meetings is helpful for more than just people with hearing loss, because it helps people, pick up things that they may have missed if somebody was talking too fast or something like that. It's a nice feature to be able to tune on the captions and get the transcript afterward. And then just keep in mind that if you're scheduling a lot of Zoom meetings back to back, that can be very difficult and very tiring for somebody with a disability who's trying to process many different things during those meetings. Like we're trying to read lips, we're trying to read the captions, we're trying to hear whatever we can hear. That takes a lot of energy. And if you have a long day staring at the computer, just like somebody that doesn't have a disability that makes you tired, multiply that by about 5 times for somebody with a disability. Just maybe be a little more patient.
Thank you. And we're coming up on our 5 minutes, so I think we have time for just one more question. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all, but I did want to ask this in particular. What are some of the challenges, or no, sorry, that was my apologies, that was a mistake. What are some universal design practices or other strategies that we might implement to help foster an accessible and inclusive environment for learning and work? There we
go. Here I would say, think about the kinds of accommodations that we provide in classes, like extended time on tests, And then think about whether or not you even needed the time constraint in general. So lots of the things that we accommodate, if we really reflect on our teaching and learning experiences, I think we could see that like we had to provide the accommodation because the thing was designed in a way that wasn't super effective or conducive to universal access in general. And maybe we can rethink those sorts of aspects of our teaching and learning and just get rid of them altogether so that people have default higher access even without having to put accommodations in place.
I will also add on with the accessibility part. I think if it's just a little bit more easier for students to not see as a big, broad task. I'll compare it to CAPS, where there's this thing like, oh, to make a CAPS appointment, it's going to be this big weight, this big paperwork. So I don't want to take away the information that is needed from students to make it inclusive and make the process tangible and good. But I think from students, there should be like a good ground foundation of family, that the SSD is a family, and that you can come to us if you have questions. If I need accommodations, is it just like then come? It should be like, do you know? Do you not know? Let's learn and find out. Let's meet you where you are. And I think overall, when we come together as a unity, when we come together as one, we create unity that can bring about change. Like we are important. And I think a lot of times SSD is left out of the equation with a lot of students' mental health. A lot of times students don't even know they have a learning disability or any disability because of the fact that it's like a taboo topic. So I think tangible ways, as I said in the beginning, is marketing strategies, more tangible, more in your face marketing for students to know that, hey, SSD is here for you. And we're here to talk about your mental health. We're here to talk about something that you may not know about yourself. And we're here as a family. I think that's honestly where my heart is coming from right now in this.
Thank you so much. So as we get close to the end, the one thing I would add on to this is to think about the value of sort of the conversations we've had today and to use something like this in the future in terms of what universal design principles, what can we do to make something, a space, a service, a benefit more inclusive and accessible. We have so many resources and so many, folks on campus that can help guide that effort. We have, the Council for Disability Concerns, Disability Culture at U of M. We have these sessions today. We have these sessions throughout this month, but consulting with folks to figure out, to ensure that your programs, your benefits, your spaces are accessible and inclusive, and always learning, always seeking out an opportunity to learn. Because speaking personally, that's the only way I've been able to do my job, and still trying to do it effectively is to make sure you're always learning and always getting that feedback from folks. So I'll close out by again thanking our panelists. I want please join me in thanking them again for their time and sharing their experiences and their expertise with us today. And I will add, as I mentioned earlier, that please remember to register tomorrow for the closing session, which is Embracing Disability Culture at U of M. It is tomorrow at noon. And also, as Natasha mentioned, there are already sessions going up on the website, and others will be up very soon. So thank you all for your time and your attention. And again, thank you to our panelists for your time as well.